With Dominic Mysterio now entering the ring, I realized that there are a lot in Lucha Libre who follow in another's footsteps, but many of them go a lot further than just simply carrying the same last name. Like who, you ask? Well... Now, there are plenty of legacy luchadors out there, and this is just a small sampling, and it comes to you courtesy of the supporters over on Patreon who voted to learn more about Mexican wrestling. And if you want to get in on that action, then just go over to my Patreon page and sign up, just like Travis Wilson, Andy Savardi, and Dakari Garment, among many others. And while I'm at it, thank you so much for the help. Rey Mysterio. Starting us off is the Rey Mysterios. Now, I previously covered them in another video, so I'm gonna go ahead and just keep this brief. It all started with the original Rey Mysterio. He started off training as a boxer before getting into pro wrestling, and the original King Mystery even wrestled at Starrcade 1990, which predates the WCW debut of the Rey Mysterio that many of us are most familiar with. Speaking of which, the man currently known as Rey Mysterio used to be Rey Mysterio Jr. and is the nephew of the OG, and he has wrestled everywhere from AAA, CMML, ECW, WCW, New Japan, and currently WWE. But before him, there was Rey Mysterio II, now known as El Misterioso. Then afterwards, El Hijo de Rey Mysterio, who is actually the son of the original. This was followed by Ijo de Rey Mysterio II, who picked up the mantle while the first son was taking a break. And then there was the short-lived second Rey Mysterio II, as well as Rey Mysterio Heredero, not to mention a few others who are less than official. Next we have Blue Demon. Now, he's probably most well known for his historic rivalry with another legend, but we'll be getting to him later on. Blue Demon has won the NWA World Welterweight title as well as the Mexican National Welterweight Championship, among many others. And also, the CMML pays tribute to the original with their tournament Leyenda de Azul, the Blue Legend Tournament. Now, towards the end of his career, he introduced his successor, Blue Demon Jr., who was claimed as an adopted son, while Blue Demon's birth sons on the other hand would retain the rights to the name Blue Demon, leaving BD Jr. to have the rights to the name Blue Demon Jr. only. But what makes the future of the story really interesting is that Blue Demon Jr.'s son is currently in training to become a professional wrestler, and that just makes me wonder what variation of the mantle will he be using, if he uses any at all. The original Phantasma may not have had the most well-known career, but he did go on to become the head of the Mexico City Boxing and Professional Wrestling Commission. During his career, his mask was modeled off of the Phantom Combo character, which his successor would initially adopt. Speaking of which, the original was also fortunate enough to have not just one but two successors, which include his nephew, Fantasma Jr., and also his real-life son, El Hijo del Fantasma, currently wrestling in NXT as Santo Escobar after demasking, and he is also the current interim cruiserweight champion as of this recording. Oh, and all three Phantasmas have gotten a chance to team up and wrestle together, which is nice when something like that gets to happen. Going back to Blue Demon's legendary rival, many people would consider El Santo to be the man who popularized professional wrestling in Mexico. His star power status as a luchador made him an absolute icon in the industry and even beyond to movies, and he was also inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. Now, El Santo started out with an interest in both baseball and football before pursuing wrestling, and when he began his career, he went under many different names before eventually going to the El Santo character. Later on, and his mantle would be passed down to his youngest son, who would take on the name El Hijo del Santo, who would reignite the feud of his father by getting into a rivalry of his own with Blue Demon Jr. Oh, and in addition, I would like to point out that there was also a female wrestler who went under the name La Novia del Santo in the 1960s, who was given permission to do so by the family, even though she wasn't really connected to them at all. Although, this really didn't last very long, as her time with the gimmick was only for several months. Later on, a male wrestler would try to use the La Novia del Santo gimmick, but was prevented in doing so by the family. Currently, two of El Santo's grandchildren are associated with the mantle. The first is Axel, who started using the name El Nieto del Santo, the grandson of El Santo, but ultimately wasn't allowed to use the name by El Hijo del Santo, who owns the rights to the El Santo brand. He did, however, allow his own son to use it, who recently began his career and wrestles as El Santo Jr. Okay, so this one goes a long way. It all starts with Rey Mendoza, a wrestler who himself had 5 sons. Now, from the beginning, he encouraged his children to get an education and become doctors or lawyers and just not professional wrestlers. However, that was to no avail, since all 5 of his sons would end up becoming luchadors. Mendoza's 2 oldest sons began wrestling in secret before his second son became the first Villano, or the Villain, and was soon after joined by the oldest brother, who used the name Villano II. They were then joined by their 3 younger brothers, who all picked up subsequent Villano numbers, making for 5 Villanos in total. But we're still not done yet, as Villano III had 2 sons who would begin a career in the ring, wrestling as Villano III Jr. and El Ijo Del Vallano III. Espanto, or The Terror, began wrestling in the late 1950s. Shortly thereafter, he was joined by his childhood friend who was considered to be something of a brother and became Espanto II. Together, they would be known as Los Hermanos Espantos, and then simply Los Espantos. They were eventually joined by Espanto's younger brother, who would become the third in line. This trios group would also get to team with El Santo before turning on him, which caused a very intense feud. After this, 2 more Espantos would join the ranks, as the original Espanto's 2 nephews took on the mantle. In addition, there would also be 2 other luchadors who were given permission to wrestle under the names Los Hijos del Espanto, despite not really being related to the family. And then there was also Espanto Jr., who was the son of the original Espanto. But speaking of which, AAA would have Espanto Jr. change his name, and they would have him start wrestling as Pentagon. He was created to be the antagonist to the luchador Octagon, with a twin rivalry sort of thing, Pentagon being the heel or rudo in the equation. However, this gimmick didn't last very long, only a year, as Pentagon was forced to retire after injury. But the gimmick would live on, as the mantle was simply switched over to another luchador. Now, in order to distinguish between the 2 Pentagons, people would refer to this one as Pentagon 2, but he was never billed as such. Oh, and he also got to make an appearance on WWF TV on an episode of Raw. However, outside of this, Pentagon was only allowed to use the name when it was approved by the promotion AAA, who owns the rights to the character. So when he left AAA to wrestle in Japan, he would go by the name Pentagon Black. And in Japan, the character would also get a brief offshoot with another wrestler named Pentagon Viper. But don't count AAA out yet, because after Pentagon 2's leaving, the promotion was still not finished and thought that there was more to tell when it came to the Octagon Pentagon storyline. So a third luchador would pick up the mantle. There was also El Hijo del Pentagon, who was portrayed by the real-life son of the original Pentagon. And this wasn't even the first time he would pick up his father's legacy, since, did I forget to mention, he was also the CMLL version of Espanto Jr. And there was also a lady Pentagon to boot. However, the one I think modern audiences are familiar with is, of course, Pentagon Jr. In 2012, the wrestler known as Kalisto was going by the name Octagon Jr. And what's an octagon without a pentagon in Lucha Libre? So the character of Pentagon Jr. was created. From there, he would become a breakout star, winning a whole slew of championships, both as a single star and a tag team wrestler with his brother Rey Fenix, both of which have wrestled for AEW. And also, let's not forget that Pentagon Jr. was also able to capture the Impact World Championship. Well, there you go. Just a small list of legacy luchadors, but who are some of your favorites that aren't on this list? Let me know down in the comments. And I also want to give some more deep appreciation to all my Patreon supporters out there, like Caleb Robinson and Matt Brummett, as well as all these fine folks right here. Thank you so much for the support, and thank you for watching. And as always, Dave knows.